Today we've got something, well, if you've ever wondered about media watchdogs and, what happens when they really scrutinize a major public broadcaster,
Right.
we got your shortcut. We're diving into the UK regulator Ofcom's ruling concerning that BBC documentary, Gaza, How to Survive a Warzone.
Yeah.
And it's not just a minor thing. This is a big deal.
Oh, it really is. Ofcom found the BBC committed what they call a serious breach of the broadcasting rules. They concluded the documentary was actually materially misleading.
Wow.
Yeah, for a factual program, especially on the BBC,
That's a really serious thing.
and it's almost the highest level of regulatory failure you can encounter.
Okay, so our mission then, for you listening, is to really cut through the noise here. We need to understand exactly what went wrong editorially. What was this specific omission that led to this? Why was it judged such a serious breach of trust? And what's this unique kind of historic public penalty the BBC is facing now?
Right. Let's unpack it.
So let's start with the documentary itself. The basic premise. It was about daily life in Gaza, right? And it gave a lot of screen time to a particular teenager.
That's right. A 13-year-old boy was very central. He essentially served as the audience's guide, showing viewers around, explaining his perspective on the conflict.
And that's where the issue lies.
That's where the trouble started, yeah. The critical information that was completely left out was the specific family connection of that narrator. This boy, the 13-year-old guide, turns out he was the son of Hamas's deputy minister of agriculture.
Okay, hold on. Hamas's deputy minister, and just for context, because this is crucial, Hamas is designated a terrorist organization by the UK government, by Israel, by the US, and others.
Exactly. So in a factual program about a, let's face it, incredibly contentious conflict zone, having your main guide linked directly to the administration there, an administration designated as terrorist. Well, that's information the audience absolutely needs to know.
It seems pretty fundamental. So what did Ofcom say about why that omission was so bad?
Their reasoning was quite clear. They stated the narrator occupied a unique and prominent position in the program, acting as a trusted guide to viewers. That's a direct quote. Because his family connection to Hamas wasn't disclosed, the audience did not have critical information, their words. Again, that was highly relevant for assessing the content and the perspective being presented.
So it wasn't necessarily about what he said, but who he was, and the audience not knowing. It becomes an issue of informed consent almost for the viewer.
Precisely. It's about audience agency, like you said. How can you properly weigh someone's perspective if you don't have key context about them? And Ofcom linked this directly to trust. They said this failure had the potential to erode the significantly high levels of trust people place in a BBC factual program, especially one about the Israel-Gaza war.
That makes sense. They didn't even need to find actual bias in his commentary then.
Correct. The failure of transparency itself was enough. Ofcom classified misleading the audience, even by omission, as among the most serious breaches possible under their code. It wasn't just seen as an error, it fundamentally undermines that public trust relationship.
Okay, that really sets the stage for the sanction, and this is where it gets, well, quite unusual in recent history, doesn't it?
It really does. Because it was deemed a serious breach, Ofcom wasn't just suggesting changes, they mandated a specific action. They've ordered the BBC to broadcast a statement prepared by Ofcom detailing the findings of their investigation.
And not just tucked away somewhere.
No. Prime time. It has to air on BBC 2 at 9:00 p.m. The exact date isn't set yet, but it's a mandated public acknowledgement of the failure.
Think about that. The regulator telling the BBC, you have to go on air, peak viewing time, and tell everyone you seriously breached the rules. When was the last time something like that happened?
That's the key historical point here. This is the first time Ofcom has sanctioned the BBC and ordered this kind of on-air statement since 2009.
The Jonathan Ross and Russell Brand incident.
Exactly. The so-called Saxgate scandal. That's over a decade ago.
So this editorial process failure is being treated with the same level of severity in terms of sanction type as that huge scandal over offensive content.
That's the signal Ofcom is sending, yes. The comparison is important. The 2009 case was about taste, decency, offensive content broadcast on air, a clear breach of content standards. This case, though, it's about the editorial process. It's about due diligence, transparency, accountability. It's about what was withheld from the audience and a failure of oversight.
It really elevates it, doesn't it? From, say, a mistake in reporting to something potentially systemic about their checks and balances, at least in this instance.
It certainly raises those questions. Now, it's important to note the BBC's response.
Right. What did they say?
They accepted Ofcom's ruling in full. They've apologized publicly. And they also pointed out that Ofcom's findings were pretty much in line with their own internal review, which they'd already conducted.
Ah, so they'd already investigated this themselves.
Yes, they pulled the documentary from their iPlayer streaming service back in February, pretty soon after these family connections first surfaced publicly.
Okay, but there's a wrinkle here, isn't there? The BBC didn't actually make this film in-house.
Correct. That adds another layer. It was produced by an independent company, HOIO Films.
So where does the responsibility land then? Did the BBC's internal review address that?
It did. Their review apparently concluded that HOIO Films bore most of the direct responsibility for the omission itself. They found that 3 people at the production company knew about the father's connection to Hamas, but, crucially, that information was never passed on to anyone at the BBC before the program aired. HOIO Films has also apologized, by the way.
So you could maybe argue the primary fault lies with the indie producer who had the info and didn't share it.
You could argue that, but that's not where Ofcom ultimately placed the regulatory blame. This is key. Ofcom's report was very clear. The BBC held editorial responsibility for the program as broadcast. Full stop.
Ultimate responsibility.
Exactly. While HOIO Films might have made the initial error, Ofcom criticized the BBC directly for failing to carry out rigorous compliance checks and provide adequate editorial oversight. Especially, they noted, for a program dealing with such a sensitive and contentious subject like the Israel-Gaza conflict. The message is, you, the broadcaster, can't outsource your core editorial responsibilities.
That's a powerful statement on accountability for public service broadcasting. The buck stops with the BBC, regardless of who made the film.
Precisely. The failure of process at the BBC level is what triggered the sanction, even if the initial withholding happened elsewhere.
Okay, this brings us to something really interesting at the heart of this. You mentioned the BBC did its own review, and that review reportedly found something else quite significant. No evidence that the narrator's father or his family actually influenced the program's content.
Yes, that's a crucial point the BBC made. Their internal findings suggested the actual material broadcasts, the footage, and the narration itself wasn't biased or improperly shaped by this family connection.
So if the content itself was deemed okay, why the serious breach finding? Why the huge sanction? It seems contradictory.
It does seem contradictory at first glance, but it hinges entirely on that principle of disclosure and trust we talked about. Ofcom's position, essentially, is that it doesn't matter if the content wasn't biased. The potential for bias, or at least the audience's perception, was altered because they weren't given the full context.
So the lack of transparency itself is the breach, regardless of the content's quality.
Exactly. Ofcom stressed that if viewers had known about the narrator's father's position within the Hamas administration, they may have evaluated the commentary provided by the narrator in a substantially different manner. That possibility, that impaired ability for the audience to judge critically, is the core failing.
It's about empowering the viewer with all the relevant facts to make up their own mind about the source.
Precisely. For a public broadcaster like the BBC, particularly covering conflict, transparency about who is speaking and from what position, it's treated as absolutely fundamental. The integrity of the process of informing the viewer is deemed just as vital as the accuracy of the content itself.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together for you listening. This deep dive really shows that this serious breach finding against the BBC, it wasn't about, say, deliberate propaganda or malicious bias in the content itself. Instead, it stemmed from a critical failure in the editorial oversight process. Specifically, failing to discover and disclose the narrator's significant family connection to the Hamas administration.
That failure, that withholding of crucial context, is what led Ofcom to rule it materially misleading. And that's resulted in this quite dramatic sanction, the first mandated, on-air, primetime statement of findings ordered against the BBC since that Ross and Brand affair back in 2009.
So the big takeaway seems to be about ultimate responsibility.
Absolutely. The case strongly reinforces that even when working with independent producers, the public service broadcaster in this case, the BBC holds the final editorial responsibility. That duty to the audience for transparency and rigorous checking, especially on highly sensitive topics like conflict reporting, is non-negotiable from the regulator's perspective.
So it really leaves us with a final thought, something for you to chew on.
Yeah, and it's an important one, I think. Given that the BBC's own investigation found no evidence of actual family influence on the documentary's content, should the potential for misleading the audience just by withholding that background context about a key guide be treated with the exact same regulatory severity as proven editorial bias or skewed content?
Or does the simple act of not being fully transparent about your source's position always constitute such a serious breach of trust, especially for an institution like the BBC, regardless of whether the content itself held up?
Where you land on that question really shapes how you think media regulation should function, particularly regarding trust and transparency.